Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you agree we've been well fed. The kitchen staff, but now the real nitty-gritty starts. Our principal speaker this evening is Mr. Lex Muir, who's sitting beside here. Nice to have Lex here. Lex is the chairman and founder member of the Newton Stewart Buns Club, which takes place next Friday night, which is clashing with our Buns Club, but we won't say any more about that now. Tickets are available for our Buns Club next Friday.
All it has 10 folk.
Peter, Dominic, Lex, and you is no self-made. But Lex is a great man. He's a founder member, as head of the Newton Stewart Buns Club. And I remember the first day he went down with his wife Gail into the Creebridge Hotel in Newton Stewart. He walked in and his heart was proud. He walked in there and he's looking at the Creebridge and thought, oh yes. Oh, the Creebridge in Newton Stewart Buns Club. Oh yes. Great. Gail, he says to Gail, his wife Gail, oh Gail, did you ever in your wildest dreams think that one day you'd be married to the chairman of the Newton Stewart Buns Club? Oh, she says, Lex, you were never in my wildest dreams. Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to Mr. Lex Muir.
I was going to say, I don't know why or how Ian would know, but Gail's dreams are much wilder than that. Ian's right, what a wonderful feast we've had. It's just such a shame it's wasted in this crowd. Now, the more observant amongst you will note that I have notes in my hand. I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I think I should explain. Not looking for sympathy, but I'm a stroke victim and it has affected my memory. To be fair, they told me it would make me blind, so I'm fortunate. But I feel a wee bit, it's very difficult standing up and doing immortal memories year after year after year, because you know, they happen all over the world, everywhere, for 208 years, something like that. And so it's very difficult to find something new, and if I'm being honest, I feel a wee bit like Katie Price's boyfriend, wondering how the hell I'm going to give you something you haven't had before. Poor Katie, she has had a tough time. She's had all these boob enhancements. In fact, she's had so many boob enhancements, she had to have a boob reduction recently, but apparently the result was a flop. It reminded me, Dominic was telling me that Jill, his wife, said to him, I'm tired of all this pretending in our marriage. What's all this asking me to dress up as a nurse and pretend I'm a nurse? I'm saying it's so that I can pretend I still fancy you. Now, Lassie went out to the chemist, the local chemist in Newton Stewart there, and she went up to the fellow behind the bar, behind the counter, and she said, you sell Viagra here? And he said, oh, aye. She says, does it work? And he said, oh, it certainly works. She says, can you get it out of the counter? He says, it's only if I take two. But I mean, of course, appearance is everything. I'm not going to close the lassies, but appearance is everything to the lassies nowadays. And they'll do anything to improve things. And I understand and I hear that Colleen Rooney has recently spent a small fortune on work done in her twat. She got him a hair replacement. It's traditional to toast the bar, our wonderful Robert Burns. It's traditional at the end of the immortal memory to toast the bar. Well, I'm going to break the tradition, folks, and I'm going to ask you to stay seated and just raise your glass for a wee second and toast the bar at the start of the immortal memory. The bar. So at least that's moving. Well, I love the burn suppers here at the base. I have to say, I mean, I can't really say it's my favourite burn supper. The reality is, Newton Stewart burn supper has to be my favourite. It's my club, my home club. But I always look forward to this place. I mean, the atmosphere is just special in here. It just seems to me that this is the type of thing that should honour the bard. All these people gathered around about us, enjoying themselves. Fantastic company, fantastic food, everything. And it's my second favourite burn supper, I have to tell you. But the truth is that I'm going to have to read some of these notes, folks, because, you know, as I mentioned, my memory's gone. But the truth is that almost all burn suppers, if not all burn suppers, quite a few of the people there aren't they fantastic Burns fans. They're here because they enjoy a good night out and a good time in company. But isn't it fantastic that we can still get together and remember the bard and enjoy ourselves in good company? And we know, anyone who's been here before, that that is just what we're going to have tonight. No one enjoyed the social side of life more than the bard. We've all heard, I'm sure, of his humanity, of his wonderful wit, his great descriptive powers, his fantastic ability to put down in words those feelings which we all have, but most of us can't communicate. If not for Burns, most of our musical heritage would have died out over 200 years ago. Can you imagine a world without Auld Lang Syne? Can you imagine Hogmanay, birthday parties, weddings without that song at the end of them? Can you imagine a gathering all over the world where people like to remember that thing which makes us so human, our love for one another? It's a peculiarity, if you like, of human nature that we rarely value something until we don't have it. I believe that Burns had that rare ability to value things. And I think it helped him to see other creatures, all creatures, in a clearer light. Of course, Burns lived in tough times. Illness and hunger were never far from his door, and his upbringing must have affected his whole view of life, I suppose as it does all of us. Indeed, he suffered as a child from terrible headaches, unceasing headaches, made worse, I'm sure, by the fact that he had to toil all day in the field and then wouldn't put down his books by candlelight at night. Robert, of course, was the eldest Burns child, one of 7, and the first. And as such, he was expected to do a man's work from a boy's age, and this did take a heavy toll even in later years. His tough upbringing must have had an impact on how Robert viewed the world. But Robert managed to take all of his emotions, love, sorrow, wonder, humour, pity and much more, and use all of these to fire his imagination, thereby creating the immense body of work which is his legacy. Robert's life was tough, as it was for most people in 18th century Scotland, but maybe worse so because of his ailments. So no wonder he found time for the simple pleasures. A dram with his friends was of course a regular treat, but the truth is it was a treat. It was painted by Heron, his first biographer, as being a drunkard, and the reality is that that was a scandalous accusation because a dram was a treat for Robert, as it was for most people. But talking about Heron just for a second, another side of the family, Heron built Carrockley House locally to us here, and I was telling Lizzie earlier on tonight a fantastic story about how Burns stayed there a few times, and the story's related and it's recorded in Carrockley House, now the hotel of course, how Burns used to sit in the bottom of the steps, great staircase in Carrockley Hotel, and recite his poetry to the Heron family. What a fantastic thought. And as chance would have it, that the Carrockley has changed hands just recently, the last few months, and the people who now have it are having a night in 3 weeks' time, the 21st of February I think, where they're going to have Burns' poems recited from those same steps. I think that's a fantastic thing, and I believe there are still a few tickets available. I have them with me. No, I'm joking. I do believe there are still tickets available. Robert did love the social side of life. He loved conversation, he loved music and song of course, and he loved the company of the lassies. I sometimes think, when I think of all these things, that I'm Robert Burns, but of course, to the popularity. Robert lived for only 37 years. In truth, he never even reached maturity. Now you might think, back in the 18th century, 37 perhaps wasn't that young to die, but it was. The average life expectancy was approaching 60 in these years, so he was robbed of 20 years of his life. He was born in 1759 in what became known, of course, as Alclay-Biggin in Alloway. Robert never called it Alclay-Biggin, it was his brother Gilbert who penned that term. And the place that you see nowadays, of course, isn't what Robert was born into. It was a small two-room place then. His father, William, added to it as the years went on before they moved away. And they did move away in 1766 when Robert was 7 to Mount Oliphant, now of course swallowed up by the expansion of air and impossible to find. And it was in Mount Oliphant that Robert first committed what he later called the sin of rhyme, when he wrote Handsome Nell for and about Nellie Kilpatrick, a wee girl who he worked with in the fields. He was just 15 years old when he penned the 7 short verses, the following being one of them. A bonny lass, I will confess, is pleasant to the ee, but without some better qualities, she's no a lass for me. And even at 15, this showed a maturity in Burns' outlook on what was important in life, as well as what was important in lassies. And he later wrote, and I quote directly here from his letters, he later wrote of his writing of Handsome Nell, I never had the least thought or inclination of turning poet, till I got once heartily in love, and then rhyme and song were in a manner the spontaneous language of my heart. I remember I composed it in a wild enthusiasm of passion, and to this hour I never recollect it, but my heart melts and my blood sallies at the remembrance. And what beautiful words! Even his thoughts and his natural speech were beautifully poetical. In 1777 the family moved to Lochley, or Lochlee. He wrote it both ways, Lochley and Lochlee, where they stayed until 1784, although the terms of the tenancy there were very harsh. Lochlee was a fantastic and massive improvement in their lifestyle, with Robert now being 18 years old and enjoying a much more comfortable life, although work in the land, of course, was still a constant and draining burden. As Robert matured into a man, he became involved in things with which his father, William, disapproved. Things such as a dancing class, how terrible, and the Carbolton Bachelor Club. Robert's father had very, very strict and unswaying principles, whilst Robert had the hot blood of a young man coursing through his veins, and there were many, many difficulties between them. Then in 1784, in February the 13th, I think, William Burness, as the family was known at the time, died, and Robert was fortunate enough to visit his father at his deathbed. And all of the 7 children, and Agnes, Robert's mother, was round the deathbed. And William found it important enough to tell Robert that he was proud of 6 of his 7 children, but not of Robert. Now this must have been very, very difficult for Robert to hear, because he loved his father deeply, and he never said and never wrote a word against him before or after his death. And I like to think that perhaps his father was trying to spur Robert on to greater things, maybe to make something of himself. And I have to say, I like to think that surely he would have become immensely proud of what he became. And it was during this same year that Robert and Gilbert took on a tenancy at Mosgiel, some 3 miles from Lochley. The first year saw a disastrous harvest due to the purchase of bad seed, or seed that in transit got soaked and started to sprout, and by the time they sowed it, they'd all died. And the second year was no better due to a terrible season, terrible weather. And so they lost most of their heart for farming and most of their money. In that same second year at Mosgiel, Robert wrote one of his most famous poems, to a moose. I'd just like to quote a wee bit for it. But mousey, thou art no thy lane, and proven forethought may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gan after glie, and lay us not with grief and pain for honest joy. But thou, I've lost it. Still thou art blessed compared with me, the present only toucheth thee. The rock a backward cast my ee in prospects drear, and forward though I cannae see, I guess in fear. This is a poem that's really worth studying. No one can really appreciate Burns' works unless they study them. I've learned this through my life, that the more you immerse yourself in Burns, the more you come to love him. And you do come to love him. But the words in Tea Moose, I think, tell us much more about Robert Burns than they do about the Moose, especially in those last 2 verses. But this same year was the year when Robert met Jean, the famous Jean. And very quickly, and to character, got her pregnant. much of course to her father's fury, who banished her to Paisley. I can't think of a worse fate. And of course he forbade their marriage. In these days you could commit yourself to marriage in writing, and it was deemed to be a formal marriage. But he destroyed that, and so it was annulled. And the twins, Robert and Jean, were born, the twins of Robert and Jean, named Robert and Jean, were born the following September. But it was to be 3 years before Robert Burns and Jean Arne were married. And then only after Jean's father had accepted Robert as a suitor. Of course, he was then rich and famous, which I'm sure was just a coincidence. But in 1788, the year Robert and Jean were married, Robert took a lease in Ellisland down near Dumfries, where you can still visit and should, whilst he started to train to become an exciseman, which was a great passion of his, or a great ambition, to get away from the land, the toil of the land. And he did manage to achieve this in 1789, and so spent the last 7 years or so of his life as an exciseman. And again in this same year, they had a further set of twins, Robert and Jean, now married of course. Both girls, but they both sadly died. Infant death wasn't uncommon in these days, but these pair of wee girls were born and died 7 and 19 days after birth. Were not even named formally anyway. And this, as I say, wasn't that uncommon in these days, but marked Robert and Jean deeply. In the winter, the following winter of 1790, while still at Ellisland, Robert finished a piece he'd been working on for about a year and a half, the fantastic Tam O'Shanter. That most wonderful tale of the follies of the drinking man. I just love it. I can't hear it often enough. I just wish I could recite it. I can, but I forget how. It's thought, and I've tried to find this, but I've heard this said before, that the twa span lang wee on Chris and Bairns mentioned in that poem make reference to Ian or Wiley could maybe enlighten to the wee Bairns. Burns, like all of us, carries the burdens of the tough times of his life with him, and this was just maybe a touch on that. And so he worked as an exciseman based in Dumfries, now living at the house in Mill Street, now of course Burns Street. And I don't know if any of you haven't visited it, please do. It's a wonderful place, and the feeling when you enter it is just fantastic. Don't see it. In January, we move forward to January of 1796, Robert's last year on this earth. And as his health deteriorated, Robert wrote, again recorded, of how he was so weak that he was beginning to crawl across the room. I mean, can you imagine how ill someone must be to have to crawl across the room? I think that tells us just how ill he had become. Between January and March of that year, in actual fact, famine was rife in Dumfries, and there were famine riots in Dumfries in March of that year. And Robert wrote again, recorded, and so we can substantiate it. Many days my family and hundreds of other families are absolutely without 1 grain of meal, as money cannot buy it. Hunger, real hunger, must be a terrible thing. But to have the money to buy the food and still be unable to obtain it must be a terrible punishment. Of course, this starvation kind of helped with Robert's failing health. And so on the 21st of July, in that year, he breathed his last. He was born in the middle of winter and he died in the middle of summer, and somehow I find a peculiar comfort in that. I can't explain it to myself, no doubt to you. Interestingly, Robert's youngest son Maxwell was born 4 days later than the day that Robert was buried, the 25th of July in 1796. The boy was named after Dr. Maxwell, the doctor who had prescribed for Robert's ailing health daily immersion at Brow Well in the Solway, in the freezing cold waters even in summer, at Brow Well, surely hastening his end. But I like to think that the wee boy being born in the day the bard was buried was maybe just a sign that the bard's legacy would never die. But we can't gather, folks, we can't gather here to celebrate the life and the legacy of Burns and finish on a depressing note. Robert, I think it's fair to say, took little from this world, but he gave so much to so many, and he left even more for the generations which have followed, including us. His works live on, and he's celebrated throughout the world, on every continent, not only by expats, but by people of every creed and every colour, every persuasion and every station in life. He's admired and indeed revered as the people's poet, and what an acclamation that is. Robert's works were, and still are, part of the school curriculum, reading curriculum. There's a word for you. Robert's works, I'll start right again. Robert's works were and still are part, I can't even get it right when I'm reading, part of the school curriculum in Russia. Whilst here in Scotland, Scots history wasn't even taught until a few years ago. How shameful that is. But at least nowadays, most primary schools, certainly in the Friesan Valley, teach Scots history, including bombings. But just to finish, even today, with all of the troubles, all of the terrible troubles throughout all of the world, all of the decent people still aspire to Robert's dream. Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will for a' that, that sense and worth of a' the earth shall bear the gree and a' that. For a' that and a' that, it's coming yet for a' that man to man the world ever shall brothers be for a' that. I think, folks, that that's a fitting note to end this immortal memory on. And I would like to ask you to all be upstanding and assist me in the immortal memory of Robert Burns.
I can't go in first.